The radio crackled with static, then silence. Captain Marcus Rodriguez pressed his back against the rocky outcrop, feeling the heat of Afghan sun bleeding through his combat fatigues. Blood seeped from the shrapnel wound in his shoulder, painting dark stains on the desert camouflage. Around him, the remnants of Bravo Company huddled in whatever cover they could find among the jagged stones of the Kunar Valley. "Actual, this is Bravo 6, Rodriguez whispered into his headset, voice hoarse from dust and desperation. "We are pinned down, grid 427896. Heavy casualties. Request immediate air support, over." The response came wrapped in electronic snow. "Bravo 6, actual, negative on air support. All fixed-wing assets committed. Stand by for further instructions." Stand by. The phrase tasted bitter in his mouth. They'd been standing by for 3 hours while Taliban fighters poured down from the ridgelines like water through a broken dam. The ambush had been perfect, too perfect. Someone had known their route, their timing, their strength. Now 18 soldiers had become 7, and the enemy was closing in like wolves around wounded prey. Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez crawled to his position, her M4 carbine clutched against her chest. Dust caked her brown face, but her eyes remained sharp as flint. "Sir, we've got movement on the North Ridge. Maybe 40 fighters moving to flank us." Rodriguez closed his eyes. Mathematics of death, 40 against 7. The equation solved itself in blood and silence. He'd led men into hell before, but this felt different. This felt final. The radio hissed again. Different frequency, different voice. Female, with a slight southern drawl that seemed almost casual despite the digital compression. "Bravo 6, this is Reaper 27. I copy your traffic and am inbound to your position. Confirm grid 427896. Rodriguez's eyes snapped open. Reaper 27. He didn't recognize the call sign, but hope was hope, even when it came from strangers. "Reaper 27, Bravo 6. Confirmed grid. We have multiple enemy positions surrounding our location. Can you provide close air support?" "Roger that, Bravo 6. I've got eyes on your smoke. You boys might want to keep your heads down for the next few minutes." "Boys," Rodriguez almost smiled despite everything. Whoever this pilot was, she sounded confident enough to mock death itself. Through his binoculars, he scanned the pale blue sky, searching for salvation with wings. Then he heard it, a sound like thunder being born in the distance. Low, growing closer, promising violence to his enemies and deliverance to his men. The sound of an A-10 thunderbolt dropping toward the valley like a mechanical angel of war. The sound of everything about to change. Major Catherine Maverick O'Brien had been flying combat missions for 8 years, but today felt different. The A-10 Thunderbolt II responded to her touch like a familiar lover, twin General Electric engines humming their deadly song at 12,000 feet above the Hindu Kush Mountains. Her call sign had followed her from flight school, earned not through reckless bravado, but through an uncanny ability to thread impossible needles with 30mm cannon fire. Below her, the Kunar Valley spread out like a crumpled brown map, all shadows and secrets. Intelligence had been thin on this one. Troops in contact, heavy casualties, multiple enemy positions. The kind of situation that turned heroes into statistics and statistics into folded flags. "Reaper 27, you are cleared hot on all targets of opportunity," came the voice from the Joint Terminal Attack Controller, somewhere in the chaos below. "Friendlies marked by red smoke, danger close authorized." Danger close. The phrase sent ice water through her veins. It meant the good guys and bad guys were so close together that her margin for error had shrunk to mere meters. One wrong calculation, one moment of hesitation or overeagerness, and she'd be writing letters to mothers instead of landing back at Bagram. Catherine banked the aircraft hard left, feeling the G-forces press her into her ejection seat. Through the canopy, she could see muzzle flashes sparking like deadly fireflies along the ridgelines. The Taliban had the high ground, classic textbook ambush. The Americans were trapped in a kill box with nowhere to run. She armed her GAU-8 Avenger cannon, feeling the familiar weight of destruction at her fingertips. 30 millimeters of depleted uranium death, capable of turning armored vehicles into twisted metal and reducing human beings to component atoms. The weapon that had made the A-10 legend and nightmare in equal measure. Bravo 6, Reaper 27. I need you to mark your forwardmost position with another smoke grenade. I'm coming in from the west. Roger, Reaper 27, popping smoke now. A plume of scarlet smoke billowed up from behind a cluster of boulders. Catherine locked her eyes on it, using it as her reference point. Everything north of that smoke was free fire zone. Everything south was sacred ground. She pushed the stick forward, diving toward the earth at 300 knots. The altimeter unwound like a clock running backward. 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. The ridge line rushed up to meet her, and she could see individual fighters scrambling for cover among the rocks. At 4,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 erupted with a sound like the world tearing in half, sending a stream of depleted uranium toward the Taliban positions at nearly the speed of sound. The ridgeline exploded in clouds of pulverized stone and smoke. The first pass was poetry written in violence. Catherine's A-10 screamed over the Taliban positions at 200 feet, her cannon stitching destruction across the northern ridgeline like a seamstress from hell. 30-millimeter rounds punched through rock and flesh with equal indifference, sending fighters scrambling for deeper cover or sending them nowhere at all. She pulled up hard, feeling her flight suit strain against the G-forces as she climbed back toward the safety of altitude. Below, secondary explosions bloomed like deadly flowers as her rounds found ammunition caches and improvised explosive devices. "Good hits, Reaper 27, came Rodriguez's voice through the radio, tight with relief. "You just bought us some breathing room." But Catherine wasn't finished. Through her targeting system, she could see movement in the eastern draws, more fighters repositioning, trying to maintain their advantage. The A-10 wasn't built for pretty. It was built for this, turning the tide when everything looked hopeless. Bravo 6, I've got more targets to the east. Recommend you consolidate your position while I work the ridgeline. She banked hard right, lining up for another attack run. This time she selected her Maverick missiles, weapons that could reach out and touch someone with deadly precision. The targeting computer painted squares around enemy positions, mathematical promises of destruction. Lock, fire. The missile streaked away from her wing, trailing white smoke as it arced toward a cluster of fighters gathered around what looked like a mortar position. The explosion painted the mountainside in orange and black, erasing the threat with surgical efficiency. But war was never that clean. As she pulled out of her attack dive, Catherine saw more smoke rising from positions she hadn't even identified yet. The Taliban weren't just well-positioned. They were well-supplied, well-coordinated, and very, very angry. Her radio crackled with a different voice. Younger, scared. "Reaper 27, this is Bravo 22. We've got wounded down here. PFC Martinez took shrapnel to the chest. He's not good, ma'am." Ma'am, even in the middle of combat, even when she was the only thing standing between them and death, they still noticed she was a woman. Catherine had heard it all before, the subtle surprise in their voices when they realized their close air support wore lipstick under her flight helmet. "Copy, Bravo 22. I'll keep the bad guys busy while you work on your casualty." She dove again, this time using her cannon to methodically suppress enemy positions across the valley floor. Each burst was calculated, precise, designed to keep heads down and weapons silent. The A-10 shuddered with each pull of the trigger, absorbing the recoil of its massive gun like a faithful horse, accepting its rider's commands. Through it all, Catherine felt the familiar clarity that came in combat. Everything else faded away, the doubts, the whispers, the lingering questions about whether she belonged in this man's world. There was only the mission, the weapon, and the men counting on her to bring them home. The radio traffic told the story of a battle turning. What had been desperate pleas for help became tactical updates, casualty reports, requests for ammunition resupply. The tide was shifting, one 30-millimeter round at a time. Catherine's fuel gauge was telling its own story. 2 more attack runs, maybe 3 if she pushed it. But the Taliban weren't giving up. They'd invested too much in this ambush to walk away empty-handed. Fresh fighters were moving in from the north, and she could see the glint of sunlight off metal that meant heavy weapons. Bravo 6, Reaper 27. Be advised, I've got movement on the northern approach. Looks like they're bringing up mortars or maybe an RPG team. Roger, Reaper 27, can you engage? Catherine was already diving before Rodriguez finished his transmission. The new enemy position was partially concealed behind a rock formation, but she could see enough to matter. She selected her remaining Maverick missile, waited for the tone that meant solid lock, and sent death flying on wings of smoke and fire. The explosion echoed off the valley walls like thunder, rolling back and forth between the mountains until it faded into the eternal silence of the high country. When the smoke cleared, the northern approach was quiet. But silence in combat was often more dangerous than noise. It meant the enemy was thinking, planning, adapting. Catherine climbed back to altitude and began a wide orbit around the valley, her eyes scanning for threats while her ears monitored the radio chatter below. Reaper 27, this is Bravo 6. Looks like you've got their attention. We're seeing withdrawal to the northwest, but it might be a tactical repositioning. Catherine checked her fuel again. 15 minutes of combat time, maybe 20 if she flew it smart. Enough for one more major engagement or several smaller ones. The question was whether the enemy would give her that choice. Her answer came in the form of muzzle flashes from 3 different ridge lines simultaneously. The Taliban had regrouped, and they were coming at Bravo Company from multiple directions. Classic hammer and anvil, designed to crush the Americans between overlapping fields of fire. Time to earn her pay. She pushed the throttles forward, diving toward the westernmost enemy position with the fury of a falling star. The GAU-8 cannon spoke again, its voice drowning out all other sounds in the valley. Rock and dirt fountained skyward under the impact of depleted uranium rounds, and Catherine felt the savage satisfaction that came from perfect gunnery. But as she pulled up from her attack run, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Reaper 27 is taking fire. I've got damage to my right engine. The voice was her own. The right engine was dying. Catherine could feel it in the way the A-10 pulled to starboard, the way the exhaust gas temperature needle danced into the red zone. Warning lights painted her cockpit in Christmas colors, red for danger, amber for caution, green for systems that were somehow still functioning despite the fact that she'd just taken a direct hit from what felt like every rifle in Afghanistan. The Taliban had learned to lead their targets. She fought the controls, using rudder and aileron to keep the aircraft straight and level. The A-10 was built to absorb punishment. Its titanium bathtub cockpit could stop anything short of a direct hit from artillery, but even the mighty Warthog had limits. Bravo 6, Reaper 27. I'm hit but still flying, continuing attack. Negative, Reaper 27. Break off and return to base. We'll call for artillery support. Artillery support. Catherine almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about the situation below. Artillery took time to plot firing solutions, time to adjust rounds, time for the Taliban to finish what they'd started. Bravo Company didn't have time. She rolled inverted and dove toward the eastern ridgeline where the heaviest fire was coming from. The damaged engine coughed and sputtered, but the left engine still ran clean and strong. The A-10 could fly on one engine. Hell, it could probably fly on one wing and a prayer if the pilot was stubborn enough. Catherine had always been stubborn. The cannon fire was lighter this time. She was conserving ammunition, making every round count. But each burst was perfectly placed, walking death across enemy positions with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She could see figures running, scrambling for new cover as their carefully prepared positions became death traps. "Holy shit," came a voice over the radio, young, excited, probably one of the privates. "Did you see that? She just took out their whole command post." Even in the middle of a firefight, even when she was saving their lives, they still seemed surprised that their guardian angel wore a flight suit instead of armor. Catherine pulled out of her dive and began a climbing turn to the south, putting distance between herself and the enemy weapons that had already proven they could reach out and touch her. The damaged engine was running rougher now, temperature climbing toward the point where she'd have to shut it down entirely. Her fuel gauge showed 12 minutes of flight time remaining, enough for one more attack run, maybe two if she flew it perfect. But perfect was getting harder to achieve with one engine coughing like an old man with lung disease. The radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice, steady despite everything they'd been through. "Reaper 27, what's your status? You're smoking pretty bad up there." Catherine looked back over her shoulder and saw the dark trail streaming from her starboard engine. Not good, but not catastrophic. Yet. "Still mission capable, Bravo 6. What do you need?" What they needed was a miracle. What they were getting was a damaged A-10 flown by a pilot who'd rather crash into a mountain than leave soldiers to die in a valley that God had apparently forgotten. The mathematics of the situation were simple and brutal. She had enough fuel and ammunition for one more serious engagement. The enemy had more fighters moving in from the north. Bravo Company was still outnumbered, still surrounded, still running low on ammunition and hope. Simple mathematics with a complicated solution. Catherine armed her last Maverick missile and began her final attack run. The targeting computer painted enemy positions with red squares, digital promises of destruction. She selected the largest concentration of fighters, a group that had taken cover behind a rock formation on the northern ridge. Lock tone, fire. The missile streaked away trailing white smoke, carrying with it her last long-range punch. The explosion painted the mountainside in orange and black, sending a pillar of smoke climbing toward the pale blue sky. But even as the echoes of the explosion faded, Catherine could see more movement on the ridgelines. The Taliban weren't finished. They'd absorbed her punishment, taken their casualties, and kept fighting. Professional respect flickered through her mind. These weren't the ragtag insurgents that populated intelligence briefings. These were experienced fighters who knew their business. Her damaged engine chose that moment to quit entirely. The A-10 yawed hard to the right as asymmetric thrust tried to spin her into an unrecoverable spiral. Catherine fought the controls, using every trick she'd learned in 8 years of flying the Warthog to keep the aircraft straight and level. The good engine was running at maximum power now, carrying the full load alone. "Reaper 27, you're trailing smoke and flame. Recommend immediate return to base." "Negative, Bravo 6. I still have cannon rounds and one good engine." That was the thing about the A-10. Other aircraft were built around their engines, their avionics, their sleek aerodynamics. The Warthog was built around its gun. As long as she could fly and the GAU-8 had ammunition, she was still in the fight. She lined up for another strafing run, this time targeting a group of fighters who were attempting to flank Bravo Company from the east. The approach was steeper this time, diving at an angle that made her damaged aircraft shudder in protest. The cannon spoke its 30mm truth one more time, stitching destruction across the enemy position. When she pulled up, the eastern flank was silent. But silence in combat was temporary. Catherine knew that more fighters would move in, more weapons would be brought to bear. The battle would continue until one side or the other could no longer sustain the cost of fighting. She was about to find out which side that would be. Flying on one engine was like dancing with a partner who kept trying to lead. Catherine fought the A-10's tendency to yaw toward the dead engine, using rudder and aileron to maintain something approaching straight flight. The remaining General Electric turbofan was running hot and hard, pushing itself beyond normal limits to keep the Warthog airborne. Below, the tactical situation was evolving. Rodriguez's voice came through her headset with updates that painted a picture of gradual improvement. Reaper 2-7, we've consolidated our position and established better fields of fire. Enemy contact is sporadic but continuing. Sporadic but continuing. Military speak for, we're not dead yet but we're still in trouble. Catherine checked her ammunition counter. 47 rounds of 30mm left. Enough for one solid burst, maybe two shorter ones if she was careful. Her fuel situation was more critical, 8 minutes of flight time remaining, and that was calculated for normal operations. Flying on one engine burned fuel faster, worked the remaining engine harder, pushed every system toward its breaking point. She could hear other voices on the tactical frequency now. Medevac helicopters inbound, artillery batteries adjusting fire, other aircraft being scrambled from Bagram and Kandahar. The cavalry was coming, but they were still 20 minutes away. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours in a firefight. Through her targeting system, Catherine spotted new movement on the southern ridge. A team of fighters positioning what looked like a heavy machine gun or recoilless rifle. Something big enough to tear apart the rocky cover that Bravo Company was using for protection. She didn't have enough fuel for a proper attack approach. Didn't have enough ammunition for a sustained gun run. What she had was one engine, 47 rounds, and enough altitude to dive straight down onto the target like a falling anvil. Sometimes simple was best. Catherine pushed the stick forward, pointing the A-10's nose directly at the enemy position. The aircraft accelerated quickly in the dive, trading altitude for airspeed with the enthusiasm of a rock falling off a cliff. Her airspeed indicator climbed past redline limits, but the Warthog was built tough enough to handle it. At 1,500 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon erupted for what she knew would be the last time today, sending a concentrated stream of depleted uranium rounds directly into the enemy position. The impact was devastating. The heavy weapon disappeared in a cloud of pulverized stone and metal. She pulled out of the dive with barely 500 feet to spare, feeling the G-forces press her deep into her ejection seat. The maneuver had cost her precious fuel and stressed her remaining engine past all reasonable limits, but it had eliminated the threat. Her fuel gauge now showed 4 minutes remaining. Not enough to loiter, barely enough to make it back to Bagram if she flew a perfect profile with no delays, no complications, no unexpected problems. In military aviation, there were no perfect profiles. Reaper 2-7, this is Bravo 6. Outstanding work up there. We've got friendly air assets inbound. Recommend you head home before your engine quits entirely. Home? Catherine almost smiled at the word. Bagram Airfield was a lot of things: dusty, crowded, dangerous, depressing. But after 8 years of combat deployments, it was as close to home as anywhere she'd known. But leaving felt wrong. Even with reinforcements coming, even with her ammunition expended and her fuel critically low, walking away from a fight went against every instinct she'd developed as a pilot and as a soldier. The radio made the decision for her. A new voice, crisp with authority. Reaper 2-7, this is Hammer 1-1. We have you in sight and are assuming close air support responsibilities. You are cleared to RTB immediately. Hammer 1-1. F-16 Fighting Falcon, judging by the call sign. Fast, agile, loaded with precision weapons and flown by a pilot who was probably half her age. The next generation of air power, taking over from the old-school brutality of the A-10. Roger Hammer 1-1. Bravo 6, you're in good hands. Reaper 2-7 is returning to base. She turned the crippled warthog toward the southeast, toward Bagram, toward whatever passed for safety in a country where safety was always temporary. Behind her, she could hear the F-16 pilot coordinating with Rodriguez, setting up for precision strikes with laser-guided bombs and missiles. Modern warfare, fought with modern weapons by pilots who'd grown up with video games and satellite navigation. Clean, precise, efficient. Catherine preferred the old way. Up close, personal, where you could see the enemy's face before you killed him. Where courage mattered more than technology and experience trumped youth every time. But that was just one woman's opinion, and opinions didn't win wars. Flying home on one engine gave Catherine time to think, something that was dangerous for any pilot, but especially for one who just spent the better part of an hour dancing with death over the Hindu Kush Mountains. The A-10 droned southeastward at reduced power, nursing its remaining engine like a wounded animal favoring an injured limb. Her radio headset crackled with traffic from the valley she'd left behind. Hammer 1-1 was making his presence felt with precision strikes, each weapon guided by GPS coordinates and laser designation. Clean kills, measured in meters rather than the football field-sized destruction patterns that her GAU-8 cannon produced. Different wars, different weapons, different pilots, but the same young soldiers counting on them to bring the fire when everything else failed. Catherine's heads-up display showed Bagram Airfield 60 kilometers ahead, a sprawling collection of runways, hangars, and temporary buildings that housed the largest American airbase in Afghanistan. Home to fighters, bombers, cargo aircraft, helicopters, and drones. The modern face of air power, where wars were planned in air-conditioned briefing rooms and fought with weapons that could strike targets halfway around the world. She'd been based there for 6 months, long enough to know which chow hall served the best coffee and which maintenance crews could work miracles with damaged aircraft. Long enough to feel like an outsider among the younger pilots who flew newer aircraft and used call signs like cyber and digital. Her own call sign had followed her through 3 combat tours. Maverick, earned not through Top Gun fantasies but through a reputation for taking calculated risks when the situation demanded it. For threading the needle when threading the needle was the difference between mission success and body bags. Today had been all about threading needles. The radio traffic from Kunar Valley was growing more optimistic. Medevac helicopters were landing, casualties were being treated, artillery was keeping the remaining Taliban fighters at a respectful distance. The crisis was passing, transformed from desperate survival into routine military operations. Catherine felt the familiar emptiness that came after combat, the sudden absence of adrenaline, the return of ordinary concerns like fuel gauges and maintenance schedules. Her hands were steady on the controls, but she could feel the tremor in her fingers that would come later, when the mission was over and there was nothing left to do but remember. Her fuel gauge showed 2 minutes remaining when Bagram's control tower came into sight, enough to make a straighten approach if everything went perfectly, not enough for a second attempt if something went wrong. In aviation, something always went wrong. Bagram Tower, Reaper 27 requesting emergency landing. Single engine failure, fuel critical. Reaper 27, Bagram Tower. You are cleared for immediate landing runway 27. Emergency equipment is standing by. Emergency equipment. Fire trucks, ambulances, crash crews trained to extract pilots from burning wreckage. Catherine had seen them work before, pulling friends out of aircraft that had become temporary crematoriums. Professional, efficient, usually too late to matter. She lined up with the runway, dropping landing gear and flaps while nursing the throttle on her remaining engine. The A-10 flew like a brick at the best of times. With one engine and minimum fuel, it flew like a brick with delusions of grandeur. But it flew. That was the thing about the Warthog. It kept flying when prettier aircraft became smoking holes in the ground. Ugly, slow, unglamorous, but tougher than a coffin nail and twice as reliable. The runway rushed up to meet her, and Catherine felt the familiar satisfaction of a successful landing. Wheels on pavement, engine spooling down. Another mission completed and filed away in the mental catalog of things that didn't kill me today. The crash crews surrounded her aircraft as she taxied clear of the runway, but there was no fire, no smoke, no drama. Just another damaged A-10 returning from another day at the office in a country where the office happened to be a war zone. Catherine shut down the remaining engine and began her post-flight checklist, running through procedures that had become automatic after thousands of hours in the cockpit. Outside her canopy, she could see the maintenance crews already examining her damaged aircraft, making the calculations that would determine whether it could be repaired or would become spare parts for other Warthogs. Such was the life cycle of military aircraft in wartime. Fly, fight, get fixed, repeat until you couldn't be fixed anymore. She popped the canopy and felt Afghan heat wash over her like a physical blow. After the air-conditioned cockpit, the outside temperature felt like stepping into an oven. But it was good to be back on the ground, good to be alive, good to know that Bravo Company was still breathing because she'd been in the right place at the right time with the right weapons. A young airman appeared at the side of her aircraft, crew chief, judging by his stripes and the tool belt around his waist. He looked like he should be in high school rather than maintaining combat aircraft in a war zone. "How's she look, ma'am?" he asked, gesturing at the damaged engine. Catherine climbed down from the cockpit, feeling the ache in her shoulders and back that came from hours of flying combat missions. "She'll need a new engine, probably some control cables, definitely a good inspection. But she brought me home." The airman nodded seriously, making notes on his maintenance forms. To him, aircraft were puzzles to be solved, problems to be fixed. To Catherine, they were partners in a deadly dance that played out every day in the skis over Afghanistan. Different perspectives on the same war. The debriefing room smelled like burned coffee and bureaucracy. Catherine sat across a metal table from Major Tom Morrison, the squadron's intelligence officer, while he filled out forms that would eventually become statistics in someone's PowerPoint presentation back in Washington. "So walk me through the engagement," Morrison said, pen poised over official paperwork. "Start with initial contact." Catherine had done this dance dozens of times before. The military loved its paperwork almost as much as it loved its acronyms, and every combat mission generated enough forms to deforest a small nation. She recited the facts in the clipped, professional language that intelligence officers preferred: grid coordinates, weapon systems employed, battle damage assessments, fuel and ammunition expenditures. But the forms couldn't capture everything. They couldn't record the sound of Rodriguez's voice when he thought his men were going to die in a forgotten valley. Couldn't quantify the satisfaction of watching 30mm rounds tear apart enemy positions with surgical precision. Couldn't measure the weight of responsibility that came with being the only thing standing between American soldiers and Taliban bullets. "Casualties?" Morrison asked. "Friendly forces report 1 WIA, non-critical. Enemy casualties assessed as 15 KIA, unknown number WIA. 15 killed in action. 15 human beings who had woken up that morning expecting to ambush an American patrol, who had instead become statistics in Major Morrison's report." Catherine felt no guilt about their deaths. They had chosen their side in this war, had accepted the risks that came with shooting at American soldiers, but she felt the weight of those lives nonetheless. Every pilot did, if they were honest about it. Any significant observations about enemy tactics or capabilities? Catherine considered the question. The Taliban fighters in Kunar had been better organized, better equipped, and better disciplined than the average insurgent cell. They'd positioned themselves perfectly for the ambush, had coordinated their fire effectively, had even managed to damage her aircraft with small arms fire, something that rarely happened to the heavily armored A-10. They knew what they were doing, she said finally. This wasn't some ragtag militia group. These guys were professionals. Morrison made a note. Somewhere up the chain of command, intelligence analysts would read her assessment and add it to their understanding of enemy capabilities in eastern Afghanistan. Maybe it would help future missions. Maybe it would disappear into the vast bureaucratic machinery of modern warfare. Anything else? Catherine shook her head. What else was there to say? She'd done her job, brought her aircraft home, helped keep American soldiers alive for another day. In the grand scheme of the war in Afghanistan, it was a minor engagement, a small tactical victory that wouldn't change the strategic situation or make headlines back home. But for the 7 soldiers of Bravo Company, it had been everything. She signed the last form and pushed it across the table to Morrison. Another mission officially documented, filed away in the military's institutional memory. Tomorrow, there would be another mission, another valley, another group of soldiers who needed someone to watch over them from above. Such was the rhythm of combat aviation in Afghanistan. Fly, fight, debrief, repeat. As she left the intelligence office, Catherine could hear the sound of jets taking off from Bagram's main runway. Other pilots heading out on other missions, carrying different weapons to different targets in different valleys. The war continued, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the relentless persistence of a machine designed for no other purpose. She walked across the tarmac toward her quarters, past rows of aircraft that represented the most advanced military technology on Earth. F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-15 Strike Eagles, B-52 Stratofortresses, KC-135 tankers, and the ubiquitous A-10 Thunderbolts that did the dirty work of close air support with unglamorous efficiency. Her war, her aircraft, her responsibility. Tomorrow she'd do it all over again. The officers' club at Bagram was exactly what you'd expect from a military establishment in a combat zone: functional furniture, fluorescent lighting, and beer that had traveled halfway around the world to reach soldiers who needed something stronger than coffee but weaker than morphine. Catherine sat at the bar nursing a Budweiser that tasted like aluminum and homesickness. Around her, the evening crowd was gathering. Pilots from various squadrons, maintenance officers, intelligence personnel, logistics coordinators. The people who made modern warfare possible through their mastery of complex systems and bureaucratic procedures. Most of them were young, confident, educated. The cream of American military aviation, sent to fight a war that seemed to have no clear beginning, middle, or end. "Hell of a thing you did today," said a voice behind her. Catherine turned to see Captain Jake "Shooter" Stevens, an F-16 pilot with too much confidence and too little experience. He was the kind of pilot who'd grown up playing flight simulator games and thought that qualified him to understand combat aviation. Young, aggressive, convinced that precision weapons and advanced avionics had made old-school flying obsolete. "Just doing the job," Catherine replied, taking another sip of beer that tasted like disappointment. "Yeah, but flying a damaged A-10 on one engine, that takes balls." Stevens paused, apparently realizing what he'd said. "I mean, that takes guts." Balls. Even when they were trying to compliment her, they still saw her gender first and her abilities second. Catherine had been hearing variations of that comment for 8 years, from flight school instructors who were surprised she could handle the G-forces to squadron commanders who worried about unit cohesion when women joined combat units. "The A-10's built to fly on one engine," she said. "Wouldn't be much of a close air support aircraft if it couldn't take some damage." Stevens nodded, but Catherine could see he didn't really understand. To him, aircraft were technological marvels to be admired and operated with computer-like precision. To her, they were tools dangerous, demanding tools that required not just technical skill, but intuitive understanding of their capabilities and limitations. Different generations, different wars, different ways of thinking about aviation and combat. "Buy you another beer?" Stevens asked. "Thanks, but I've got an early brief tomorrow." It wasn't entirely true. Her next mission wasn't until the afternoon. But Catherine had learned that sometimes the easiest way to end conversations was to invoke the universal military excuse of duty calling. Stevens nodded and moved on to easier targets, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her aluminum-flavored beer. The television above the bar was showing CNN International, volume turned down so the subtitles had to carry the weight of world events. Something about congressional hearings, budget battles, political controversy back in Washington. The kind of news that seemed to exist in a parallel universe to the one where young soldiers got ambushed in remote valleys, and pilots flew damaged aircraft home on prayers and determination. Catherine finished her beer and headed for her quarters, a small room in a temporary building that housed female officers. The accommodations were basic but private, which was more than most soldiers could say. A narrow bed, a metal desk, a wall locker for her gear, and a small air conditioning unit that fought a losing battle against Afghan heat. She stripped out of her flight suit and stood under a lukewarm shower, letting the water wash away the dust and sweat of another day in paradise. Through the thin walls, she could hear other pilots talking, laughing, planning their evening activities. The social dynamics of a combat squadron, played out in a temporary building on the far side of the world from home. Catherine dried off,